Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, researcher, minister, and friend, Charles Paisley, founder of ChristianGospelChurch.org and the author of Come Out of Her, My People. Charles, it's good to be back and to talk about John Wimber. We've had a lot of feedback, some of it good, some of it negative, but I think by and large, the majority of people are hearing things that they've just simply never heard. And you get the few outliers who are, I guess, still hardcore, let's suppress all the history, let's don't talk about this because on some deathbed confession or whatever it was, maybe months before, weeks before, John Wimber changed his mind. So let's cover up his entire past. We get some of those as well. I'm more of a fan of let's document the history because people seem to be covering up the history in many, many various splinter groups that emerge from latter rain. So here we are today, documenting the history of John Wimber.
Yeah, John, I'm ready to keep going. We've got some more interesting stuff to talk about today, and I got to preface this one the same I have prefaced everyone before we start this arc, John. I really am reluctant to talk about these guys. I really am, because in one way I don't really have a dog in the fight. I don't have much to do with any of that stuff. And my main interest, as I've said all along through this, is going through these branches of the latter rain movement is an exercise in finding places that I just don't want to go when I've left the message. I'm not interested in jumping into another branch of the latter rain movement that is highly likely to produce another cult, because I firmly believe the doctrines of the latter rain movement are a cult factory, and I just don't want anything to do with that, John. And so here we go today, John. We're talking about we're really talking about how three branches of the latter rain movement reconverged to produce the new Apostolic Reformation. And again, I've said before, I feel like these things are just kind of obvious, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're only obvious to people who are on the outside looking in. But we are on the outside looking in towards the New Apostolic Reformation. And what's really ironic about the New Apostolic Reformation, John, and about this third wave of Pentecostalism is, I remember when all these things happened. I mean, this all happened in our lifetime, John. And the sects of the message, especially I know the sect I come from, we were very keenly observing everything that happened, because the events which gave birth to the New Apostolic Reformation actually fit into message eschatology. William Branham had a set of sermons called False Anointed Ones at the End Time. This is a famous message sermon. I'm sure you know all about this one, John. This is a very famous message sermon, the False Anointed Ones at the End Time. And in this sermon, William Branham, at the time, he was definitely talking about Oral Roberts and A.A. Allen, is who his sermon was against. But over time, the cult repurposed it, because it didn't really get fulfilled with Oral Roberts and A.A. Allen. But the essential concept is, in the last days, there would arise a false version of the message. And the false version of the message would be doing signs and wonders and miracles, and they would steal some of our teachings and doctrines and beliefs, and they would do a lot of things like us, but they would reject our holiness standards. And these false anointed ones would lead the masses of Christianity to damnation and the tribulation, John, while the rest of us escaped out of here, in the rapture. And so when the New Apostolic Reformation began to come together, John, and the Toronto Blessing and all this stuff is happening in the New Apostolic Reformation, the people in the message are very keenly aware that it is some of our preachers going into the Vineyard movement and these other places teaching message ideology. We're keenly aware that Paul Cain and the others were going around doing this. And we were keenly aware that they were importing elements of our belief system. And our preachers very boldly proclaimed from our platforms that the people forming the New Apostolic Reformation was the false anointed ones at the end time, and therefore the Toronto Blessing was a sign that doomsday was upon us all, right? And we were a doomsday cult. And so they never miss an opportunity, John, to teach us all that we're all about, the world's about to burn up, and so we better stay and, obey the message. And so that's what the Toronto Blessing was. So we were watching all of this, and spies were sent into Vineyard, into these churches from my sect of the message to gather data and bring it back and would report back. And they'd come back and Raymond Jackson would confirm to us, yes, indeed, ladies and gentlemen, I can confirm to you these are the false anointed ones. And that's how we looked at the New Apostolic Reformation. So we had in real time our cult viewpoint of what was going on in these movements, John. And so that's incredibly ironic, right? And I start that going out, and maybe, John, maybe we can put up here a few quotes. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this, but Paul Cain got skewered. By the time you come into the 1990s, the message was turning on Paul Cain like nobody's business. I mean, I think Lee Vale was the first one to practically burn Paul Cain in effigy for taking the beliefs of the message to the false anointed ones. I mean, there was veritable outrage across multiple sects of the message. How dare Paul Cain take our blessed, holy revelations of the message and feed the pearls and the meats and the revelations of God to the swine, right? I mean, it was like that. That is how the message viewed this whole thing. And again, I know that people in all that, they don't even know any of that happened, right? They don't even know that that's what was happening in message churches in reaction to what was going on. But there's absolutely awareness through all those years that message preachers were going to all these places and giving away our blessed revelations to the NAR, to the Vineyard guys, to the Toronto Blessing people. That's what happened, right? That's what happened. And there's lots of recordings from preachers back then talking all about that and characterizing it that way in those years.
And I think that's the closest we'll ever come to hearing that Charles was a spy. But there were no vodka martinis in Charles's case. So, I don't have a dog in the fight either. Whenever I began studying Wimber, it wasn't because I was studying Wimber. It was mostly because I was studying Paul Cain. That's how all of this began. And specifically, I was studying exactly what you're describing. How did this splinter group emerge from the doctrines that we had from William Branham? And it's difficult because if you look at one of the NAR groups right now, their doctrines are significantly different from Branham's. But if you understand the architecture and the framework that it was developed from, you can kind of see how it evolved. But you have to look at each milestone along the way in its evolution. Wimber was one of those milestones. That's really how all of this started. And I was specifically looking at the kingdom theology because William Branham was not teaching the dominionism like they do in the NAR. There was no Seven Mountains mandate in the form that it exists today. I'll just say it like that. But I was studying the kingdom theology specifically because if you look at the transmission of this thing from what William Branham taught through what Wimber taught through Kingdom Now through all the way to the what the NAR has as their kingdom theology, you can find how the extra biblical things that Branham taught, how those began to spin like a snowball going down a hill. And for me, each phase of its evolution, it's really the same doctrine. It just has different details surrounding the doctrine. So as I'm looking at the kingdom theology, Wimber's kingdom theology to me is no different than Kingdom Now theology. And as I began writing the page and looking at it, I had one of the Wimber cult, I don't know what you call the guy, but he basically was somebody who was wanting to set me up. And he comes in, and his first attack was really the kingdom theology. He said Wimber did not teach Kingdom Now. And I was trying to explain, well, yes and no. The kingdom theology as it developed was very much the same. I'm glad it happened because in talking to him, I began to understand I can't really explain this without going really deep into describing that foundation. Because when I assume people see that all of this is the same, if you've been taught that this is biblical, what they teach today, well, you're not going to see all the milestones along the way. So I had to take a step back and start going deeper into the history. Part of that we're doing today, but more of it I'm continuing to do on the website. But make no mistake, Wimber working with Paul Cain, that is how we developed into the mess that we see today.
There's so much complexity and nuance in this all, John. And in these even in, this is what, our fourth episode. We might have one more after this. There's just not adequate time to address all of the nuance of all of it. The shepherding preachers, the shepherding followers that Derek Prince and Bob Mumford and those guys had converted, some of them actually join into Vineyard as the shepherding movement implodes in the 80s. That makes a second faction. And then you get a period of time, John, as you come into the middle 80s, where the Kansas City prophets, John, and the tangled latter rain web that they are connected to, which includes the message, they start making their entrance into Vineyard. And when they come in, John, when they come into Vineyard in the 80s, they, especially through Paul Cain, are already connected to a network of churches outside of Vineyard, which have been latter rain churches for decades. Okay, Paul Cain comes from, roots of this that have connections all the way back to Sharon Orphanage, all, the very heart of the message, to the heart of William Branham's groups, all that. So as he comes in, John, he is networking. He is networking in other of the latter rain prophets. He's networking in other of the latter rain preachers. He's networking in other branches of the latter rain movement too. All right, you've had that, that really nice lady on your podcast a number of times, Laura Lynn, I think was her name, and she comes from a branch of the latter rain ideology. Paul Cain played a role in networking all of these groups together, because back in those days, the latter rain factions, a lot of them had turned on each other, right? But what was happening in Vineyard kind of gave a breath of fresh life into it all. And within these other branches of the movement, John, they already had the apostles. They already had the prophets. There was already a global apostolic network in the message before Vineyard even existed. There was already global apostolic networks in the latter rain branches before Vineyard ever even got going, right? And what's happening is John Wimber is opening the doors, and he's letting key figures in these pre-existing apostolic networks come into the Vineyard movement. Paul Cain being the most prominent example of this. And they're networking Vineyard churches to this movement on the outside, the latter rain movement that's been there all along. And as all of this is happening, John, as this influence coming directly from branches of the latter rain and Vineyard is happening, Charles Peter Wagner, was also in Vineyard in those years, and he sees what they're doing, and he coins the term New Apostolic Reformation, and he coins that to what he sees of these growing apostolic networks within Vineyard. And here's the thing, I think he had to realize, and John Wimber I think they had to realize that this thing wasn't new. They had to realize, and they just, I don't know, they like to always repackage it and say it's new, right? They can't say, hey, this is the next phase of the latter rain, because the latter rain they knew was a crazy movement. They can't say this is the next phase of the message, right? Because they know the message is a crazy movement. But what is honestly happening, John, is the apostles and the prophets of the senior branches of the latter rain are coming into Vineyard and commissioning new apostles and new prophets, both in Vineyard and in some of the other groups in orbit of this. And what they commission in those years is the New Apostolic Reformation. And there's nothing new about it. It is just a continuation of the fivefold ministry structures of the latter rain movement in its various iterations, in its various branches. The message being one of those branches. And so the New Apostolic Reformation, Jan, that's why when you and I look at it, and people from our backgrounds look at it, we're like, oh my goodness, there's so many similarities, there's so much the same, and it even looks appealing. And I've even seen people, from our groups, like, how is it possible that these people seem so similar to us? Well, they must have had a divine revelation from God themselves. How else could they have got so much like us? Well, the answer is no, they didn't have divine revelations from God. There's different branches of the same ideology, and they got the same ideas, the same concepts from the same root source in the latter rain as we did. And fivefold ministry is one of the key distinctive doctrines of the latter rain movement. And fivefold ministry is New Apostolic Reformation, John. It's the exact same thing. It's the same thing.
Earlier I said that whenever I was studying John Wimber, I was looking at the kingdom theology, the framework, the architecture, and I've learned that I have to break things down. I can't just make statements like that because, by and large, people who were indoctrinated in this type of movement can't really pick it up because it takes a lot of work to do the groundwork and understand what is Christianity and how am I different from Christianity. That takes a lot of work, and honestly, it takes a lot of breaking down your pride. It took years for me to break down my pride enough to realize, well, what I believe wasn't quite right. As I'm looking at this architecture, there are 5 main points that I look at. The first one is the way in which the kingdom is presented with John Wimber's theology and with Branham's and with NAR. There is an expectation for the supernatural. That's why you have Bethel's supernatural school. I think they call it Hogwarts and other funny names. They use those names when you're not in this group because the expectation is for the supernatural. In mainstream Christianity does not discard miracles. Miracles are possible, but they're viewed as rare, and they're not viewed as something that is expected in daily practice. But when you're in Branham's theology, Wimber's theology, NAR, it is a expectation that daily you're going to have some sort of expectation of the supernatural, whether it's angels and demons, whether it's healing, whether it's positive confession, whatever is their model for this, they have this. The second thing is power evangelism. Wimber's credited for it, but that's not where it came from. Wimber got it likely from Paul Cain and others like Cain. Along this development, there is a notion that evangelism must be accompanied by signs and wonders. In mainstream Christianity, evangelism is focused on teaching, doctrine, personal testimony, power encounters, as if you can even really call it that. I question whether you can call it that. They're very rare in mainstream Christianity. And that's why in the Latter Rain movement, Branham would say mainstream Christianity is cold formal religion. We are not, because we have power evangelism. There's power in what we do. There's signs and wonders. And they would advertise even in their meetings, signs and wonders. The next thing is the use of spiritual gifts. And obviously, in the charismatic movement, that's where the core is. The core of what they believe in Pentecostalism, charismatic movement, NAR. It is this use of spiritual gifts. And in mainstream Christianity, they still believe in the gifts, but they're not emphasized. It's not the core. In other words, the gifts are the byproduct of being a good Christian, not what makes you a good Christian. In charismatic Christianity, it is the core. In the charismatic movement, there's this concept of training to, I guess I'll use the word activate. You train to activate the supernatural. In other words, we're expecting that we're going to have this power evangelism. So if you're going to be an evangelist, you have to be trained how to activate whatever this is that you believe. Or for a rank and file member, for a lay member, there's this expectation of constant supernatural in your life. So how do you activate that? And in mainstream Christianity, because their core is not this, there's no reason to have this training. So that's sort of extra biblical. But the last thing is the church model. In Latter Rain, they taught that the churches, mainstream churches, were cold and formal. You go, there's a structure, you're expected to sing some songs, worship, hear a sermon, and sometimes at the end there'll be a testimony. There is a structure and an order to the service. Now it changes from denomination to denomination, but by and large there is a structure. In the model that was established by Latter Rain, somewhat before this in Pentecostalism, the church model is really kind of free-flowing. You have many of the elements that you see in mainstream Christianity, but there's always this dedicated time at the end for healing, deliverance, prayer line. They basically structure their services in such a way that you can see this power evangelism. And to the Wimber crowd, who argues that no, the kingdom theology is different, if you understand that framework, that's how you understand Wimber's theology really is no different than Kingdom Now, just in the naming. And the NAR version of the Kingdom theology, it's really much the same. The structure is exactly the same. It's just how it is preached, the trivial details of the doctrine, and how it's implemented. Those are the differences, but the core is exactly the same.
But as far as power evangelism, that goes back old in this ideology too. I mean, all the way back to the 40s, they were doing that power evangelism stuff, where, yes, we're going to convert the people with signs and wonders rather than the gospel. Which is, again, we talked about in our last episode, Jesus said, "In a wicked and adulterous generation seeks for the sign, but the only sign given is the sign of the resurrection. As Jonas was 3 days and 3 nights in the hearts of the earth, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 hearts and night of the earth." The resurrection, the gospel, is how you convert the people, not signs, wonders, and miracles. And that power evangelism, yeah, is absolutely the sort of stuff that they were promoting. I'm not aware of Chuck Smith promoting power evangelism, as far as I know. I could be mistaken, but I've never come across him actually promoting that. But yeah, it's basically that they would use the gifts of the Spirit to attract the masses, and do all that. Yeah, and that's deep in this ideology as well. But one of the big components of all this, and let me throw in one other thing, John. John Wimber rejected power evangelism at the end of his life too, John. We go through these Wimber letters. He rejected all this stuff in here. In this book. I want to talk about this if we get time too. He changed his mind.
Yet
on
they
all this
still
stuff.
sell the books.
I know. They still sell the book. Hey, you want to find where he rejects it in this? I mean, I could find you the page, but it's right about the middle of this book. He says, it's basically a section where he says, should signs lead or should signs follow? And basically he changes his mind that no, signs shouldn't be leading the way for us. Instead, those signs should follow, which is, I'll be honest, John Wimber, this is a good book, what he did in here. This is good stuff. I mean, if they would take this stuff and actually follow it, they'd be a lot better off. And the ones who have taken the stuff he said in there and follow it, they are better off.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
Coming back to Manifested Sons of God, because what makes the New Apostolic Reformation, isn't, to me, it isn't really Manifested Sons of God. That don't really make the New Apostolic Reformation the New Apostolic Reformation. What makes them the New Apostolic Reformation is their structure of apostles and prophets and so forth. And that is fivefold ministry. Fivefold ministry is what makes them the New Apostolic Reformation. And then, yeah, the rest, they just have their own flavor of Manifested Sons of God and stuff, which also was in the message in its own way. And John, let me talk about that just a minute, because I noticed in some of the comment sections, like, it seems like there is confusion around where fivefold ministry came from. Fivefold ministry came into this ideology via latter rain. Fivefold ministry does not exist outside of the latter rain movement and its branches. It does not exist. If you are using fivefold ministry concepts, terminology, and language, you got that from a branch of the latter rain movement. That is where it came from. And if you think you got it from somewhere else, you've been tricked, deceived, confused, you're looking at it wrong. It came from the latter rain movement. And that is so important to wrap your mind around. Like, because fivefold ministry is one of the core distinctive doctrines of the latter rain movement, right? And so I know that it's important if you're in this ideology to try and justify it, to say that it didn't come from the latter rain. And it's very important to find another place to reground it. But the truth of the matter is, everywhere that fivefold ministry is in the world today came through the latter rain movement. They are the ones who popularized it. And the fivefold ministry has two really important pieces, John, that produce the new Apostolic Reformation. One piece of it is that in the past, the church lost the apostles and prophets, and in the last days, this fivefold ministry needs to be restored, which includes restoring apostles and prophets. So the very premise that apostles and prophets were lost and need to be restored, that's one component of fivefold ministry. But another component of fivefold ministry, which is equally important, John, is that they believe that the fivefold ministry is necessary to do the task of equipping the church with the powers and the signs and the wonders and the perfect unity in order to bring them into completion, perfection, maturity, the man-child. There's different ways to term it. But the fivefold ministry is the means to get the church into this completed state. And when this ideology was originally formulated, fivefold ministry was the means to get the church to manifested sons of God, right? They started out with the notion that we're going to get to this manifested sons of God state. And they started to go back and basically hunt and find in the Bible, how do we get there? How do we get to perfection? How do we get to completion? And they came across the verses around in Ephesians 4, and they started to develop the belief that we need to restore a fivefold ministry, which is their version of what they think those verses mean. And that fivefold ministry will then complete the church, bring it into that final state of empowerment, of unity, perfect perfection, perfect, all of this. And then in that state, that church can then achieve manifested sons of God. They can achieve the kingdom on earth. They can achieve the end of day scenario, right? And so fivefold ministry has those two important pieces. The idea that the apostles and prophets need restored, therefore they're commissioning apostles and prophets, and the belief that that fivefold ministry has the special mission to complete, finish, perfect, mature the church for its end of day state, which empowers it. And that concept, those two elements of ideas came out of latter rain and spread far and wide. And there are ways in which the fivefold ministry beliefs evolved after you left the message, or after it left the latter rain, but it still, most of it contains those two essential concepts. And now, John, I know, like in the message where we come from, the churches you come from are the tape churches, right? And of all the sects of the message, your sect of the message was the least into fivefold ministry, okay? But pretty well every other sect of the message is drowning up to their eyeballs in fivefold ministry. It is the means to get to perfection. We didn't believe the means to perfection was just the tapes. The means to perfection also included the fivefold ministry. And so these teachings I know these ones backwards and forwards too, John. And this is a version of this is what got into the new Apostolic Reformation. The first version of it came in through the Kansas City, through the shepherding movement. But then they got a new revised advanced version of it through Paul Cain and stuff when they started to intersect with the other branches of the latter rain movement. Okay? And let me say one last thing too. One last thing on fivefold ministry, just to help people, okay? To put this together. Because it can be hard to accept what I'm saying, that fivefold ministry only comes from the latter rain movement. And again, I'm going to point everybody to a book. This is a great book, The New Charismatics by Michael Moriarty. And John, the stuff you're talking about, how manifested sons of God came into the NAR, this book traces that path. And you're correct. It goes through John Wimber's Kingdom Theology. Okay, that was a stepping stone into it. But this also traces how they got the fivefold ministry stuff too. And I want to encourage you, get this book, read it. It'll give you all of the how all that happened, ladies and gentlemen. What happened, John, is I found this book while I was still in the message. And this book indeed says that fivefold ministry came from the latter rain. That's where it popularized from. And when I found this, I'm like, no, absolutely not. Can't be. Impossible. No way. He's got to be wrong. And so I did not accept that fivefold ministry came from the latter rain because this book said so. You know how I came by that belief, John? Look at these books on my shelf. I have the primary sources of all of these guys. I have the primary source. I have the writings of the latter rain elders on my shelf over here. I got all kinds of stuff, John. Fivefold ministry came from the latter rain, John. It did. This guy's right. He was right. It did come from there. And that's what I found by looking through all the primary sources. And let me tell you, if you guys want to look this up, how to do it, maybe when you think of terms from the Bible, fivefold ministry is not a term in the Bible, is it? Fivefold ministry is not in the Bible. There are terms that are develop over time that are used as shorthand to refer to specific beliefs. There's a term, for example, like the hypostatic union. Hypostatic union is not in the Bible, right? But people use that to refer to a belief they think they see in the Bible. Fivefold ministry is the same thing. It's a term that is not in the Bible, but people use it to refer to a belief they think they see in the Bible. And you can take that term, fivefold ministry, and you can go look, who are the people who coined that term? And you can follow through history the people using that term. And John, if you follow through history all the people using the term fivefold ministry, where do the dots converge? They converge on the latter rain movement. They all came out of the latter rain movement, John, like Derek Prince, who pastored a church with one of the elders of the Sharon Orphanage, right? Or Ern Baxter, whose members of his congregation were elders of Sharon Orphanage. Or William Branham, who the core of the early message came from the latter rain movement, right? The latter rain movement is where fivefold ministry beliefs came from. Now, the latter rain movement got the beliefs out of the British Israel branch of early Pentecostalism. So they do have a past, right? You can trace it further back, a little further back, through the British Israelite branch of Pentecostalism. But latter rain is where those ideas exploded into what they are today. And that is where people actually got them from today. And so I just encourage you, go look. If you have fivefold ministry, it's important to actually acknowledge you believe a distinctive doctrine that was developed and promoted by the latter rain movement, right? And then Manifested Sons of God being another one. And those two originally came as a package deal. Fivefold ministry was the means to get you to Manifested Sons of God, the kingdom now on earth, okay? All right, and that is what they got in the New Apostolic Reformation. It's what John Wimber was slowly building towards. It is the same ideology. They just changed the terminology a little bit. That's all it is.
I recommend anybody who thinks that the fivefold ministry is biblical, go study what the word apostle means. Just look it up. It's a messenger that's sent out, right? Otherwise, what kind of apostle messenger are you? It's more of a hierarchy than it is describing what apostle even means.
There's so much there to unpack, and to work through. And if we had time, maybe we could do another episode some point down the road and talk through some of the elements of all that. Because again, this was a core doctrine where I come from, and there's so many nuances to all of this. There's just so many nuances. A person can hardly pack them all in just a short episode of these things. But when you come to the end of John Wimber's life, John, and you're on the other side of the Toronto blessing, you're on the other side of things starting to go crazy. Well, guess what? John Wimber repudiates fivefold ministry too, John. He turns on that. So not only does he, look, here's a whole chapter in his pastoral letters on fivefold ministry. Right? John Wimber turned on these beliefs. And what is so, just like when he rejected power evangelism in this book, here he's rejecting fivefold ministry. What he's doing, John, is, and this is, again, we could call this a tad deceptive. He don't say in here, hey guys, I'm changing my mind. You have to know that he was teaching something else before. He's changing his mind here. What he says about fivefold ministry here is the opposite about what he said about fivefold ministry in the 80s. What he says about power evangelism and signs and wonders in here, some of it is the opposite of what he said in the 80s. And when you're inside one of these movements, John, I used to be inside one of these movements in a leadership position. I can understand why John Wimber did that. because he's trying to, I think, John, I think he's trying to turn the ship slowly, right? And if he jumps out and says, in a really bold way, fivefold ministry is of the devil, we reject it. Signs, wonders, miracles leading the way is of the devil, we reject it. Well, all kinds of people would have turned their back. But when he goes at it this way, and he don't say, hey guys, I'm changing my mind, I was wrong. When he goes at it this way, he can gently lead people away from it, right? Maybe had he lived longer, he might have been more successful at it. But he is very clearly changing his mind on fivefold ministry. He is very clearly changing his mind on signs, wonders, miracles leading the way through power evangelism in here, right? He's very clearly changing his mind on positive confession in this. And it starts roughly about the middle of this book, which was wrote. The middle of this book starts being wrote after the Toronto blessing, okay? And in the last 3 and 4 years of his life. And the actual rejection of fivefold ministry comes the last year of his life is when this one is wrote. It's actually, I think it might be 3 or 4 months before he died, comes out this rejection of fivefold ministry. And what happens, John, is he continues to use fivefold ministry language. He continues to use latter rain language, but then he starts putting slightly different definitions to things and moving it in a better direction. And, to people who are from this ideology, if you take John Wimber's definition of fivefold ministry here and John Wimber's definition of signs and wonders, what he does in this book, it's not really all that bad anymore. You know that, John? he turns it into something not all that bad, right? If you're practicing it the way that's in this book, I'll be honest, I don't think I really got a problem with it. But that's not what he was doing before, right? That's not what was happening before, right? And what was happening before is what's in the New Apostolic Reformation. So as John Wimber's life rolls on, John, and all of the commissioning of apostles and prophets and the creation and expansion of the fivefold ministry networks in Vineyard and the Toronto blessings happening, I don't know why John Wimber woke up. I really do not know why John Wimber changed his mind, right? Because just like Derek Prince, you can find towards the end of their life where they're saying the opposite of what they said earlier in their life, but they don't tell you why. John Wimber don't really tell us why he changed his mind on all this stuff, and we're just left to guess at their motives. And we can assume it's good motives. But I want to tell you a thought of mine, John, and you tell me what you think. John Wimber was I think he was literally on his deathbed in August 1997. What are the odds John Wimber never even wrote this? What are the odds that other people wrote this stuff for him when he was dying and published it for him? What are the odds? And that's kind of my deep thinking. I don't even really know that John Wimber wrote this. Nobody really knows that John Wimber wrote this. All we know is some guy said, hey, I'm editing John Wimber's letters, and here's the one he wrote on his deathbed, ladies and gentlemen. Did John Wimber actually write that? I don't know if he wrote that or not. But nevertheless, this is got John Wimber's name on it, and it was published after he died. As far as I know, it was published more or less after he died, the book. But anyways, I would encourage anyone in Vineyard, John, or anybody that respects John Wimber, just read this book. If you're following, the more healthier model that he put in the end of this, you're probably not in such a bad state. But nevertheless, this still remains a gateway to the crazy ideology. You're still using the terminology and ideas and concepts that came from the latter rain if you follow John Wimber's stuff in here, which is a gateway to the crazy. And I still don't want the gateway to the crazy either, John. So, you can still be healthy yet a gateway to crazy and be something I don't necessarily want to be part of. John, I feel like we've been all over the place with this episode today, but hopefully we've said something that's useful to our listeners.
I too question whether or not John Wimber wrote those letters. The problem is we'll never know who actually wrote them unless somebody who did write them confesses and said, hey, I wrote this, John Wimber did not write this. But for me, that argument, since it can never be answered, that's not where my head goes. We have examined very thoroughly through the course of our podcasts people who have been taught this very, very false theology from Branham, the framework that was laid, and we have talked about people who died because of it, people who have been spiritually led astray, people who have been under authoritarian control and their lives ruined. This is a cascade of error that developed from Branhamism. If you, at the end of your life, realized, I have taught something that have caused people to die, physically and spiritually. I have taught things that maybe not to the same level of extreme as some of the extreme cases of the splinter groups, but had the potential to develop into authoritarian cults where people's lives were ruined. I believe that if he actually wrote this, he would be so explicit in saying that I denounce everything that I have said prior to this. I was wrong. And if you follow the things that are wrong from my teachings, then you have the potential to die, be led astray, spiritual death. Bad things can happen. And I would say also remove every single thing, every single trace of my publications, because I don't want that to fall into the wrong hands. I would say this, if it were me. Would Wimber say it? I don't know. It all depends on what kind of character he was. So for me, it goes back to the character more than the question, did he write them or not?
When I look at the people like John Wimber, like Lonnie Frisbee, like Derek Prince, men of that caliber, I have not formed a personal opinion on them as individuals. I really don't. I don't know. I don't know what to make of them. They're enigmas to me, John. They're kind of like Gordon Lindsay. He's an enigma to me. I cannot figure it out. What is going on in that head of theirs? But what I do know is they're teaching the same ideology. They're teaching elements of the same ideology that they learn from the same sources, that comes all the way back to the same roots in the latter rain. And I know that ideology is dangerous. And so while some of these people may have been perfectly fine, good people on their own, they were promoting an ideology that everywhere it goes, positive confession, manifested sons of God, fivefold ministry in combination, produces horrors, John. It produces horrors. If you get those three things in combination, they just produce terrible things. They do. And I look at the three of those things like dials, John, where you can kind of go from low, medium, high. You can get fivefold ministry, low, medium, high. You can get manifested sons of God, low, medium, high. You can get positive confession, low, medium, high. And if you get all three of those dials up on high, you get a Jonestown massacre. You get a Faith Assembly Warsaw massacre. You get Hobart Freeman stuff. You get mass death when you turn all three of those up on high. That has happened over and over in this ideology. Mass death when you turn all of those up on high. And when you get them down on lower levels, there's still deaths that happen in these things, John. There's deaths that happen in the churches I come from. There's deaths that happen in the churches you come from. Part of the reason I left the message to begin with is because people were unnecessarily dying from the ramifications of this ideology. That more than anything is what started waking me up, watching people die, and this ideology has a long, long, long history and track record of that. And it's very unfortunate. I am not the least bit worried about the new Apostolic Reformation taking over America, John. That's never going to happen. You guys are crazy. What do you guys think that's ever going to work out from you? You guys are nuts. I mean, you're never going to take over nothing, man. You couldn't even take over Chicago. I mean, let alone America. So that's never going to happen. It's all a pipe dream, John. Like, they don't scare me from that respect, but they'll be harmful to the people in it. It will. People are already being hurt. People continue to be hurt. It's a sad and unfortunate thing, that movement and that ideology. What they're chasing is a pipe dream. They are not going to become manifested sons of God. They are not going to be empowered as Christ on earth in the way that they think. The things that they're chasing are a fantasy, John. Is there even a last day revival in the Bible? I don't know. On this side of the message, I don't really. Again, this is my opinion. People out there might have a different opinion. I don't even think last day revival's in the Bible. I don't think it's there. I mean, maybe, that 144,000 stuff's the last day revival, maybe, but who knows even what that is? I mean, it's vague, right? I mean, it could just be something with Jewish people in the land of Israel, right? It might not have nothing to do with us at all, the way you read it. So, is there a last day global revival? I don't see it in the Bible. I mean, the Bible says the world gets worse and worse and worse, not better and better. I mean, so I mean, the whole thing is a pipe dream, John. I mean, and it's very hard for me to even go along with most of the core concepts of that ideology anymore. You know, the apostles and prophets and pastors and teachers and evangelists of the first generation equipped the church with everything they need to be perfected and unified and reach the fullness of the stature of Christ. We don't need new ones to do it. We already got everything we need in the Bible to get to that state. We just need to keep following what they gave us to begin with. And you don't need positive confession is not faith. Positive confession is false witness. Positive confession is breaking one of the 10 commandments, right? I mean, it's a sin. Positive confession is a sin. And I have developed some strong beliefs around these things on this side of the message, John. And I have generally avoided sharing my own viewpoints on these doctrines because, I don't know. I was in a cult my whole life. I might still be confused. You know what I mean, John? So, ladies and gentlemen, don't take something just because I said it. All right? I am not like our false prophet. I am not the great authority, okay? Look into these things yourself, Look into some of these books. The New Charismatics by Michael Moriarty. This is a fantastic book. It really will take you through this ideology. And I didn't believe a thing in this book when I read it. Okay, I'm telling you, I only believe the stuff in this book because I went through primary sources trying to figure out this guy was confused. But Mr. Michael Moriarty, I'm sorry, you were not confused. I don't even know if this man's still alive, but you were right, sir. You were right about it all, and I was wrong. And John, the Counterfeit Reformation by Hank Hangraff. This was wrote while Toronto Blessing was going on and stuff. This guy was there and witnessed and went through some of these things. This is another terrific book where a guy was debunking this while it was happening. Counterfeit Revival, Hank Hangraff. Look into John Wimber's pastoral letters. He indeed rejected the dangerous pillars of this ideology at the end of his life. He rejected fivefold ministry formulation that he had been promoting earlier. He rejected the signs, wonders, miracles should lead the way model in this book. He rejected really the extremes of positive confession even in this book. And so what he did, John, and I make sure I end on this note. At the end of John Wimber's life, the Toronto Blessing churches are split away. The churches influenced by that split away. The churches influenced by the Kansas City prophets split away. Numerous churches divide and schism and split out of Vineyard because John Wimber, he is indeed rejecting New Apostolic Reformation beliefs. He's saying, nope, there will be no new apostles and prophets, right? Only a few years after saying, Paul Cain's the greatest prophet. Now he's saying, no, there will be no apostles and prophets. He changed his mind. And of course, you know what happened when John Wimber started saying these things? Paul Cain had a great miraculous experience from God, John. That John Wimber was turning away from the miraculous and turning away from the move of God. And Paul Cain issued this great prophecy. You'll actually find this referenced, I think, in some of Mike Bickle's stuff. Paul Cain issued this great prophecy. And lots of people across the Vineyard churches that were being influenced by this stuff heeded Paul Cain's prophecy and broke away from Vineyard. And what they formed when they broke away, John, was already the New Apostolic Reformation. They were already the New Apostolic Reformation when they were in Vineyard. And as they break away, Paul Cain and the other Kansas City prophets and the other latter rain guys, some of them they brought in, they have already connected this faction of Vineyard with the pre-existing latter rain networks. They're already connected to some message churches. They're already connected to, like Reg Lazelle's Glad Tidings Tabernacle, right? Where that nice Lord Lynn lady is from. They're already connected to these people before they break away. And as they break away, they're now bringing together, they're finding a new home in the latter rain movement, the pre-existing latter rain movement churches. And they're joining in with their pre-existing fivefold ministry structures. And this New Apostolic Reformation is taking off. And it literally is at that point. It is the faction of Vineyard that was expelled, and it was a variety of other pre-existing latter rain apostolic networks merging together to form the New Apostolic Reformation. And as I've kind of said before, the best way to look at it is it's not a hierarchy. It's not a hierarchy. This thing hasn't been a hierarchy since the 1950s. What it is today is it is competing. It is competing hierarchies. It's competing apostles and prophets with their own independent networks. And there are points in times where they cooperate together. There are points in times when they're competing with each other. And what are they competing for, ladies and gentlemen? They're competing for you. They're competing to have you in their seats. You are the prize, ladies and gentlemen. You are what they are competing for.
And in that, I think, is my biggest issue with John Wimber. It isn't that I don't think he's a good guy. I think he probably was a good guy. I think his heart may have been in the right place, and there are many people who have vouched for that. But what he did was he gave all of this architecture that I'm describing credibility. And that, I think, was his biggest mistake. And he never really apologized for giving it credibility. Because of his endorsement for ministries like Paul Cain and others, the problem was people who saw the endorsement, they moved towards it, and that ideology was able to continue and actually grow bigger than what we had in latter rain. I would say that what we see today is much, much larger and more global than what we had with William Branham. So he gave credibility to all of this, and it is a mess. So much more we could get into. Maybe next time we'll go a little bit deeper into the messes that were created. So if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org and christiangospelchurch.org. For more about the history of William Branham and the healing revivals, read Come Out of Her, My People. And for more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, you can read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, both available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.